Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. Just recently, there was a Facebook private message conversation that happened on the Personality Hacker, page, Facebook page, that massively triggered me in a rather embarrassing way. So a woman wrote in to Personality Hacker on the Facebook private message and made a truncated comment that wasn't a question. It wasn't really guided. It was just a comment. And Charis, our assistant, wrote back this super long, thoughtful response. And at the end of we're talking 4 paragraphs worth of response to this woman. And at the end of it, the woman's response back to Charis was, totally disagree. And that's it. That's all she said. And I'm a person who doesn't get triggered often. But for some reason, I instantly got irate at this woman. And I wrote back in the message, and it's embarrassing how rude I was. But I wrote back in this private message, Charis, don't even spend any more time talking to this woman. Obviously, she doesn't appreciate thoughtfulness, and she doesn't have any thoughtfulness in her comments. So just basically, I was dismissive of her in the same way that I thought she was dismissive of Charis. And the woman wrote back a paragraph, and she called me rude, which she was accurate. I was rude, and she was able to defend herself, right? She was able to be articulate then, and I commented on that. I was like, oh, well, now that your ego is all triggered, now you're able to write more than 2 words. But, and it was so stupid. It was so stupid. And then afterwards I thought, holy crap, why did I get so triggered? What was going on there? So the top layer of that is that I have a value right now, a very burgeoning new value of thoughtfulness. Now, that might not sound like a new value because I'm always talking about thoughtfulness and the importance of it, but I mean, it's become a thing for me. And I have a almost cancerous fear within me that if not enough people are thoughtful, that the trajectory that I'm banking on, which is the trajectory that we're headed towards, a higher evolved consciousness that will quote unquote save us all, that won't happen. And I have a lot of fear around that. So when I see a discrepancy in thoughtfulness, clearly I get triggered. And then the deeper layer of that is that I fear that I'm not thoughtful enough. So the interaction of me getting triggered allowed me to shine a light on a dark space of my own feeling of inadequacy. So what we want to talk about in this particular podcast is this concept of getting triggered. And is it possible to get to a point where you're no longer able to be triggered? So we want to unpack what a trigger is. We want to unpack this concept of getting triggered. And then we really want to talk about ways that you can transcend or at least manage this phenomenon of getting triggered.
Triggering happens for all of us. I mean, we were just talking before we hit record, and one of the best places to experience this, if you want to go practice not getting triggered, because you can probably get triggered here a lot, is go into an online format like Facebook, like an online social media platform. Facebook seems to be one of the better places to find triggers for yourself. You run into people of all different backgrounds, all different ideas, different worldviews. And for some reason, when we're online as people, just like when we're on the freeway driving, we tend to utilize the anonymity to feel bigger than we are or feel more emboldened to speak our minds, quote unquote. And so often you'll get people who, in real life, if they were sitting in a living room or at a cafe talking, would be much more cordial, much more have much more diplomacy around what they're saying, are very bold and will just, quote unquote, call it as it is from their perspective, whether that's how it is or not. And you see, fights break out on Facebook or disagreements or arguments. This is a great place to see this probably happening in your life, or at least in somebody's life near you. You've probably seen some kind of a battleground of ideas conflicting on a Facebook channel, for example. So that's one place I think that you can see this happening. Literally freeway driving is another one on a very base level. But I think what we're talking about is those times when you feel like you have this emotion that comes up for you, this very strong emotion, whether it's offense or righteous indignation or stamping your feet, or you've got to talk or articulate your position, or you're going to die in the next 10 seconds if you don't. It's this idea of being triggered, this emotion that comes up for you, this very strong emotion that comes up for you.
Yeah, and triggering, I mean, it does feel like you're going to die to some extent, because triggering is related to some pretty ancient programming. We talk a lot about ancient programming, some of which has served us for a long time, but may or may not be serving us now. And a trigger is anytime your ego feels obliged to defend itself. And our ego is there to keep us safe. Our ego is there to be defended. It is the way that we stay alive, is having an ego that wants us to stay alive. So when the ego takes a hit, when the part of us that wants to stay alive takes a hit, the obligation to fight is to some extent rooted in a sense of survival. Like, it wants to survive. It needs to live. And this is an arrow coming at it. So triggers can feel like arrows. They can feel like, I mean, in sort of a dramatic way, it can almost feel like a verbal death threat in some way to the ego. If it allows itself to see the trigger for what it is, which is a fear of inadequacy or something within itself that needs attending to, then if you attend to that, then you're no longer the same person. That part of your ego dies. That's what happens in personal development, personal growth. We go through many stages of ego death. We become unrecognizable to ourselves. And the part of us that wanted to keep us physically alive, it hitches a ride with the psyche to want to keep us alive and preserved as we are as individuals and personalities. So the ego it's defending itself against a much more abstract form of death, but it's still trying to protect itself from a death. So it doesn't really want to see that outer world feedback. It doesn't want to see the part of it that is experiencing any sense of inadequacy, because then if it has to work on that, then the ego will have changed. You will be a slightly different person. So the ego gets used to being grabby, holding on to as it sees itself in the moment. Now, one of the ways to transcend being triggerable, and by the way, I'm saying this from the perspective of somebody who's observed it in others but has not attained to it yet. Obviously, I'm a person who gets triggered because I just acknowledged a story around me getting triggered within the last couple of days. It appears to me that the best way to find a state of getting untriggerable, or at least less triggerable, at least being able to manage the triggers, is to recognize what a trigger does for the individual, that it's a service that is provided from the outside world. Now, we did a podcast a bit ago on what's called the drama triangle or the empowerment dynamic. I think it's actually called the empowerment dynamic, that podcast is. And it reframes this concept that the world is filled with villains, victims, and heroes. It reframes it that there are no villains, victims, and heroes, but there's challengers, creators, and coaches. So instead of being a world filled with victims or people on the receiving end of other people's, Machiavellian, deeds, you're actually a creator that goes through the world and creates your experiences. And instead of seeing the world filled with villains who are out to get you, you instead see the world as filled with challengers, challenges that force you or encourage you to rise to the occasion. And then there's no heroes. There are only coaches who help guide the way. One of the higher levels of recognizing that there are no victims and villains is seeing yourself as a creator that bumps up against challengers that will expose parts of you that need work, need attending. And the trigger is often the tool that the challenger will use unconsciously, not intending to. They just show up. They're just doing their thing. But a trigger is the tool that challengers use to force creators to acknowledge what needs attending. How do we create the best world we can? The best way to do that is to allow these triggers to shine a light into dark places and recognize that there's something inside of you that needs attending.
What's interesting, think about just, when you're getting triggered by something, this idea of somebody challenging you and this notion that it's something that you're dealing with. We have a tendency to think that someone's doing this to us. But just imagine you're reading something on Facebook that one of your friends wrote, maybe about, I don't know, a worldview or political stance that you don't agree with, and you feel righteously indignant or you're offended by what they said or did, and you get all worked up into a frenzy. Well, imagine if you were reading a book written 300 years ago from somebody that's been long dead and has said the exact same thing. Would you be as triggered? Even though it's coming from outside yourself, would you be as triggered, or is this something that's coming from within you and it just happens to match with something that you're dealing with internally already anyway? My guess is that if it was something ancient, like a writing from 300 to 500 years ago, the person's dead, you wouldn't say, that person that wrote that did this to me. You'd recognize, if you got triggered around it, it's your deal. It's not the other person's deal. But for some reason, when it's somebody in your real-time experience, we have a tendency to project onto them that they're doing this to us. They're hurting us on purpose. They're offending us, or they're making us have to stand up and be righteous for something that we really believe in, or a cause that we really have value around. So I think this is just an exercise. Next time you read something or get triggered on something, just imagine, what if this was said by somebody recorded 100 years ago, they're long dead, or it was written a long time ago? Would I still be as offended by them, or would I recognize that it's something inside of me that's coming to the surface, that I'm dealing with, that I'm grappling with in my life?
Yeah, one of the most difficult pieces of this, I think, is the seductive nature of getting offended. I'm not sure exactly. I mean, I haven't really charted it back and tried to figure out why we have such an addictive relationship with the emotion of righteous indignation. My suspicion is because when you get righteously indignant, the purpose of it is to get inspired into action. And if you are indignant about something, which the emotion of righteous indignation needs to be there. People do truly terrible things, and we should get indignant about it. Like, we should go, yeah, that's not okay. You shouldn't be able to, say, harm children, or you shouldn't be able to take advantage of people who are weaker than you. So the indignation gives us a boost of inspiration to get us into action. But if we have divorced righteous indignation with getting into action to right or wrong, if we just experience the emotion itself, it can feel like a hit. You can feel like, ooh, that feels good, right? We're like, ooh, I like that feeling of getting offended and being right? Like righteous indignation, the root there is being right. I like that. And so we can get really addicted to that feeling and forget that the original purpose of that emotion is not to think that somebody else was trying to offend you. The original purpose of that emotion was to go, hey, it's not okay to hurt a child, or it's not okay to hurt the elderly, right? Like, it's not okay to be like a profound violent dick. That's not all right. So if we abuse this feeling and we get addicted to it, then it might, basically what we might have to do is we might have to go into sort of emotional rehab. We might have to go through a time period where every time indignation or offense gets triggered, we recognize that this has become a drug for us. That's the first part, is detoxing ourselves from the emotions that feel so good. And then once we separate ourselves from that emotional dependency or that emotional addiction, then we can graduate to the next level, which is when we do feel triggered, when we do feel this emotion, we're no longer addicted to it, so we can let it go a lot easier. But now we have to go to a place of awareness, a place where we recognize that this trigger isn't about, like you mentioned, Joel, it's not somebody doing something to us. It's somebody providing a service for us. We already feel something around this. Otherwise, we wouldn't get triggered. And so they basically shine a light into dark spaces. I was thinking, if somebody bumped into us in a subway, and maybe they bumped into, I don't know, you're a woman and somebody bumps into your breast. And that always hurts, but let's say it hurt really bad. Or let's say something didn't feel right in your breast. You might get really angry at the person, but it's a subway. It's a busy subway. You recognize that it wasn't personal. They just bumped into you. Maybe they weren't looking. But something didn't feel right about it. So you end up going to the doctor to get it checked out, and come to find out you have a lump, right? So in some way, that stranger that bumped into you, they made you aware of something that if it was allowed to persist, could eventually kill you. So they did you a service by making you aware of something that you now have the power to do something about. Maybe it's early stages. Maybe you are right in that window of being able to do something about it. And so they provided you a massive service. So underneath your breath, you're like, oh man, thanks, random subway stranger, for pointing out something that could have been a real problem down the line. That is a very empowered way to understand triggers. A very empowered way to understand triggers is to recognize that when somebody, quote unquote, bumps into us, and maybe they were being a jerk and maybe they meant to do it, but somebody bumps into us and we feel it and we go, ow, wow, why did that one hurt so bad? Instead of like saying, oh, you shouldn't have done that to us and why did you do that to me and you're such a big jerk. Instead of doing that, our actual attitude should be one of gratefulness. Thank you for bringing attention to something that I otherwise would not have seen. Thank you for helping me identify something inside of me that needed some attention. And so there's a big reframe here with triggers that can get us to a point where when we experience a trigger and feel gratitude, we are really close to getting to a point where we're not very triggerable at all.
Yeah, and it's highlighting the things that we want to work on. It's highlighting the things that are trouble zones. And it's almost like if you can, and I'm not here either in this full expression of this, but imagine going through life and every time you have that rise of feeling offended or righteous indignation pop up for you, say somebody says something, you're like, oh, how could that person say that? And you feel you're like, wait a minute, what does it say about me that this is so offensive? What is this saying about me that this is so righteously inducing for my life? Why am I getting so righteously indignant about this? And then start examining your own heart, your own mind, and say, what is it about me right now that's causing this to come up? What mirror or light is being shown on what I'm experiencing in my life that is causing this problem? I think of like, so I've got 3 children, and sometimes kids say really rough things to you as a person, right? I mean, I've had one of my sons, I won't tell you who, has told me that he thinks that maybe I'm a little ugly or something at one point, like, oh, you're ugly or whatever, like not in a mean way, but he was talking about, oh no, excuse me, it was fat. He's like, I'm a fairly skinny person.
Yeah. So, well, it's worse when he calls me fat.
And he's called you fat as well. And it's like, for me, I'm like, I'm not fat. I don't think of myself as fat. I never see myself. I feel like I'm very skinny. So I don't even entertain the idea. It doesn't bother me a bit. But I guess when he says it to you, you have had some image issues in your life. And so you actually take it, oh, maybe he's right. Maybe he's telling me the truth. And you see him like the day before say that I'm fat. And he's joking around. Like he's kind of kidding and stuff, right?
Well, he kind of I think he's basically saying that as adults we're bigger than him.
Yeah, that's what he's trying to say, right? But I'm not triggered about it. And you are. And it's the same information, the same data. So is he doing something to you and not doing something to me? Is he like actually being mean to you but not actually being mean to me when he says this?
Right.
Or is there something about you that's reading this different than I read it? And if you've got kids, your kids have probably said some rough stuff to you. And you've probably dismissed it because they're kids. What do they know? You're an adult. Or maybe you have taken it to heart. Maybe they're like a 3 or 4-year-old and they've said something and you're like, oh, maybe they're right. Maybe they've got a point, and you take it to heart that you're a bad parent or you're fat or you're ugly or whatever that they've said to you, or you're not fun or you're not a good mom or dad. And what does that say about you as a parent that you took that to heart or that you dismissed it on the other side of the coin? So think about it in this term, like anybody that says something to you, it's really you that's coming up from this. And what is it about you that's bringing that to light? What is it about you that's responding in that triggerable way?
Now, one thing that makes this entire topic feel really icky to some people and has them wanting to dismiss it is the idea that you're not requiring other people to take responsibility for their actions. Like if everything is on you, then what about other people? Shouldn't they be taking responsibility? And the answer is yeah, they should. They should be taking responsibility for their triggers. That's the thing that they're responsible for, is to see other people's feedback toward them as shining a light in their dark places. But you can't really force anybody to do that. You can't, you can't say, well, you just aren't seeing how these triggers are all about you. all you can do is focus on yourself. All you can do is be a creator of your own world. So if you're in a situation where somebody is constantly saying demeaning things to you, or mean or rude or horrifying things, and you're at a point where you're like, hey, I don't think I'm getting triggered. I think that person's just mean or a dick or whatever. Then one of the things they might be illustrating to you is that you might need to change circumstances. You might need to trade out the people you're surrounding yourself with. That's just as relevant as this idea of getting triggered. But we're not really talking about surrounding yourself with kind of, ugly-hearted people. Which, by the way, my guess is that a lot of these people who, we would call ugly-hearted are people just filled with their own triggers and are just reacting instead of responding. But the only thing that you can really do is keep rest of your own, your own stuff. And if you're in a bad situation, it's not like you just go, okay, well, everybody just treat me badly. Go ahead. I guess I'm, a doormat. Now you can just walk all over me. That's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about people who are not necessarily after you. They're not people who are treating you badly. They're people who you're just going through life and bumping into. We're talking about just like general offenses. And these general offenses are extremely helpful for getting inside it. They might be some of the best mirrors that we have for personal development. One of my favorite quotes is from Rumi, who said, if you are irritated by every rub, how will your mirror be polished? So think of these rubs as, instead of irritants, think of them as ways that we polish ourselves. We see ourselves through other people and vice versa. And so if we can get to a point where we understand that this is a public service that other people are doing for us, not in a victim-y way, not in a way where like we just allow ourselves to be, people to treat us poorly. We're not saying that. But rather recognizing that people who otherwise don't treat us poorly are causing offense, right? We see those people as providing a mirror for us, providing a flashlight to, light up these dark spaces of areas that we might have, our ego may be so attached to that it won't allow us to see it in any other context.
Yeah, I want to just reiterate what you said a moment ago. If you are in a situation where you're being abused or treated harshly, you need to get out of that situation. You need to create boundaries for yourself or deal with that at the outset. I don't think we're talking about if you're married to a man every night when he comes home, he's beating you and he's calling you names and belittling you. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about daily life and bumping into strangers and other people, or friends and family as well. But we're not talking about abusive situations. In that situation, we would very much give you advice to create boundaries or remove yourself from that situation. That is somebody doing something to you. Now, at advanced levels, not physical violence or abuse, but advanced levels, even that is probably, there are people on the planet that can sustain even abuse levels of trauma. I don't recommend it. I think we should remove ourselves from that equation. That's my personal stance. But there are probably people that have gotten themselves to the place where they could even sustain abuse and not get triggered or not feel anything at all in certain ways. But again, I just want you to be clear that we're not talking about sustaining abuse. We're definitely talking about bumping into people. So boundaries are important in this when you're doing that. And, you got to start where you're at too. You may not be in a place where you can go for long periods of time and not get triggered. It might be some baby steps. At first, you might need to work on this a little bit. And you're going to mess up. I still get triggered. Antonia still gets triggered. Everybody's going to have points of insecurity as we scale up in life. And let's just keep scaling what we're doing more and more. Like, kind of as you grow and develop, your problems don't really go away. They just get more sophisticated and they're more nuanced. So these triggers aren't going to just go away as you're scaling up. They're probably going to get more nuanced and more sophisticated in how they're showing up for you, which gives you a great opportunity to continue to work on these. It's going to be a never-ending journey for you. But as you stretch, you're going to realize the things that once triggered you 5 years ago are no big deal now. Like, other things are troubling you now. Other things trigger you now. And that thing that somebody said, your friend said 5 years ago, you were all upset about and you were freaking out about and you were, oh, I can't believe they said that. Now it's like, that's just what she does. That's her thing, and that doesn't really affect me anymore. I don't have an insecurity about that part of me anymore. That's something I like about myself, or is cool about myself, or whatever that you got triggered about before.
Yeah, I recently got triggered again on Facebook, Facebook. Like the mother lode of triggering dialogue. I recently got triggered on Facebook because there was a comment in the Intuitive Awakening group, which recently I made a comment on a podcast that recommended people go to the Intuitive Awakening Facebook group. And then as we got like this influx of newbies, like all of a sudden drama broke out.
Not necessarily because of the newbies.
No, not because of the newbies.
It just was a coincidence.
It was just a coincidence. And so like there's all this drama and that's what the newbies are, like that was their first introduction, which was mortifying. But that's okay because it happens and that's just reality, right? Like that's just what is. But then somebody made a comment that we weren't any different than any other Myers-Briggs Facebook group, which it was like an arrow to my heart. I got so triggered. I was like, well, first of all, we're not a Myers-Briggs Facebook group, right? I'm like making all this defense, inside of me, and I'm like ready to just defend. And then after the moment of the trigger, because, you and I, what we do is we support each other through our triggers. When we recognize that one of us has a trigger, the other one goes, okay, so what is going on inside of you that is creating this trigger? And so we provide that service for each other, which is great, except for when we're getting triggered by each other. That's the only time that doesn't work out so well. But when it's triggered by the outside world, we've gotten really good and efficient at helping each other work through them.
Yeah.
And so you said, well, what is actually going on here? Like, is that accurate, first of all? Do you know that to be true? And second of all, what is this actually saying? And I was like, well, it's saying that's a major fear of mine. I would like a very, growth-oriented Facebook group that talks about all maps and models, and Myers-Briggs is like one of them, but we also talk about other maps and models. And for the most part, I think our Facebook group is great. I love the people in there. I really, really appreciate our group. And every once in a while, drama is going to happen because we're all at different levels of development, and drama is just a part of life. You just can't escape it, especially online where, as you mentioned before, people's balls tend to grow through the anonymity, and they say things, and you can't read intent and you can't read body language, so it's just going to happen. But one thing that came from it was you and I went, I think that we need to be seeding more content around the Intuitive Awakening movement in the Facebook group. And so a responsibility of ours that we had unconsciously shirked became very clear to us. So the trigger shone a light in a dark place that you and I have an obligation and responsibility to continue to seed better quality content. And that means that we need to be not shirking that obligation. Like, that's on us. So every trigger, I've started to see every trigger as a gift. Every single one. It doesn't matter what it is. Every trigger is a gift. And I'm not untriggerable. I hope to be there someday, but I don't know if that's actually going to happen, especially in our relationship. We talked about with Jason Gaddis in the relationship podcast that a really deeply intimate relationship, like, you're going to get triggered. Like, the deeper you go in intimacy, the more you get triggered. But I'd love to get to a place where I'm far less triggerable. And I think I've already graduated, to a certain extent. But I feel like as long as I experience these triggers when I get them, as long as I experience them as gifts, then they don't have power over me. They don't have mastery over my behavior. I might in the moment react quickly, but I've taught myself to step back and go, okay, so what's going on here? So I don't feel like the triggers are controlling my behavior. And I think that's, for me personally, that's a win. That's a major win, to get to a point where the triggers are not controlling my behavior, which they did on Facebook in that private message. So I'm not 100% there. And yet that Facebook trigger, right? And the behavior that was generated from that I created was itself a gift. So having appreciation for it will remove the power of the perceived defense. And yeah, I don't get to feel the delicious emotion of righteous indignation as much. I don't get that one. But I've started to see righteous indignation, unless, of course, again, it's indignation about like truly terrible, terrible occurrences. I've started to see righteous indignation as like fast food for the soul, right? And while fast food tastes really good initially, its long-term, cost is one that I really don't want to have to be paying. And so I would like to eat this, the soul version of kale. I would like to eat the soul version of, high density foods, nutritious food. And so if I do that, I think that my long-term gain, I'll definitely see the benefits, which I already have. And I've noticed the same thing in you too. Your triggers, right? You work through them so beautifully. I would say that you naturally have higher emotional intelligence than I do. But I would say that your triggers are you've gotten so good at navigating them. You do such a good job of like stopping and having a moment when you check in with yourself and just allowing some space and then going, okay, so what's going on for me? And I think you and I overall, like our happiness improves, our development improves, our growth improves. And I think that I would just highly recommend trying to integrate this reframe because I think it's overall improves the satisfaction of our lives.
As you're talking, we can wrap up with this. I think I have a little bit of a model emerging, or at least I think what I'm doing as a reframe when that happens, when I stop. Again, I'm not perfect. You're giving me a lot more credit than I would probably give myself. But I do know that I think what I do is I use the same thing that causes the trigger to get myself out of the trigger. So what do I mean? Well, if trigger is around pride and ego of not wanting to look deficient in some way, well, what I can do is I can attach myself to a higher ethic of pride or ego in a sense of how do I want to see myself. So if I get triggered around, let's say, somebody says I'm not a good business owner, I'm a shyster or something, and I start to get triggered like, wow, am I really shyster online? Do I propagate things that aren't true and try to steal money from people or something? Am I like a weird business owner? I can say, well, I don't want to be the kind of, like that hits my ego and starts to activate my ego. And one thing I can do is say, okay, well, what's a better ego stance I could have? What's a better, and I hate the word pride because it sounds like it's an arrogance. It's not an arrogance, but what's something else I can be proud about myself? And that is that I have the ability to slow the process down and focus on not feeling these intense emotions of being triggered or feeling like I've got to prove myself against that. So I've taken the same thing that's triggering me, and I've almost found some kind of a higher ethic to attach it to pull myself up out of that. I don't know if that's where it ends. I'm sure there's even higher levels than that, but that's one of the hacks. And now I'm to the point where I don't even do that all the time, but I've used that a lot, especially it's something I'm really new about. Like it's triggered me and I wasn't expecting it. I'll use that to pull myself up out of that in almost like a hack to get out of that space. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Am I explaining that in clear terms?
Yeah, it's that awesome emotional aikido,
I guess,
that you feeler perceivers have.
Yeah. I don't know if it'll translate to all personality types, but definitely works for me in how I try to shift that energy or shift that perspective in what I see.
Yeah, no, it's so good. I think one of the things I've tried to do is just make sure that I don't take any action in the moment. Like I give myself time and space.
Slow way down.
Like bullet time. Like slow everything down to bullet time. And if I respond in the moment, I'm probably going to mess it up worse. So if I get triggered, I just slow everything down. And I wait until I'm no longer feeling a strong emotion. Like if I can go back to logic, I know that I'm okay. But that's of course because I'm a thinker. So for you, it's more of an emotional aikido. Like you shift the feeling, like you stay with the desired feeling, but you pivot to something else.
A more positive expression of that desired feeling.
Exactly. So,
and you're getting more clarity and getting back into that thinker space, away from that strong emotion.
Exactly. So like different strategies may vary depending upon your type, and you may have to come up with a strategy that works for you. But I think for everybody, when you get triggered, slowing the process down, giving yourself time and space, it cannot be overstated. Just back off and just allow yourself to take no action until you feel like you're back to yourself.
Yeah. What do you think? Where have you found yourself triggered online, in the real world, on the freeway, with your family, friends, strangers you bump into? What have been some of your experiences in this? How have you maybe had bad experiences with it, where you don't like yourself in that experience, or maybe you've had a great experience where you were triggered and you worked through it? We'd love to hear your personal stories. We really want our website to be a place of personal stories and sharing what our expressions and personal adventures have been through all these personal growth experiences. Come over to personalityhacker.com. You can leave a comment, share your story, ask a question right below this podcast, or you can join our community of like minds on Facebook.com/personalityhacker or Twitter.com/personalityhack.
If you like what you hear, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you're feeling a sense of reciprocity, we would love it if you would leave us a rating and review on iTunes. If you do so, they cross-promote us more often. They raise us in their stats. So it would be really awesome if you would be willing to do that. We'd be very, very grateful.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
We can't wait to talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.